Okay, cool. All right, so first of all, thank you, Manita, Jim, and the rest of the program committee for inviting me here. I'm really honored to fly all the way around the world to be part of this meeting. So before I actually start into the science, first about me. So my name is Scott Bachman. I am on the faculty at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado in the USA. And I'm also the technical modeling lead for a company called Seaworthy, which I'll actually be talking about in this first talk. So I did my PhD at the University of Colorado with Baylor Fox Kemper, who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And I did my postdoc at University of Cambridge with John Taylor, doing submesoscale and mesoscale turbulence. For the last 7 years, I've been the ocean modeling lead at NCAR, basically doing ocean model development, turbulence, geophysical fluid dynamics, and a couple other things. So part two of that is that I arrived literally 24 hours ago, and my body thinks it's 10 o'clock at night right now, so I might fall asleep during my own talk. And part three is that I actually have 2 talks today. So I think the program says that I'm giving a 2-part talk on anisotropic viscosity, but actually my first talk is going to be on what we're doing at our company called Seaworthy and its relation to GFD problems. And so I'd like to start with that for this first session. So first of all, this is not an advertisement for our company. We're a nonprofit scientific organization, and I think I'm really hopeful that you guys find some of our work very interesting, especially the parts that connect with GFD problems. So let me tell you a little bit about the backstory here. So key points to remember. I assume a lot of you are familiar with the idea of marine carbon dioxide removal, and that you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, storing it in the ocean. To keep global temperatures in agreement with the Paris Agreement, we actually will require marine CDR. So the reason for that is that ocean-based CDR has the potential to remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. And the part where we come in at Seaworthy is we're trying to fill in the gaps regarding monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. So we're trying to develop scientific tools and the science itself to actually monitor, report, and verify the amount of CO2 that's being removed from the atmosphere to enable carbon markets and to enable academics to work on these problems. And so at Seaworthy, that's really our purpose. We're building ocean modeling software. We're also doing problems in geophysical fluid dynamics and ocean chemistry. So you can think of us kind of as a small but very potent scientific organization. So the talk today, I'm going to give you an overview about why we exist, and then I will spend the second part of the talk discussing the GFD problems that I think you all are here to look at. So this plot shows the transient climate response to emissions, and so we have those nice apocalyptic images on the right. The thing to take away from this slide, or at least the thing that makes this very interesting, is that from historical or geological records, we know that the change in surface temperature of the Earth is almost like very linearly proportional to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this plot is a mix of observations and model projections, basically saying that if we follow a certain CO2 trajectory, we'll get X amount of warming. Sorry, trying to switch slides. Yeah, it's not showing up on my screen now. Like I can't, oh, okay. Okay, hang on, I got it. Okay, we're back. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. Can we just keep it like that?
Offline, I'll.
looks good. Okay. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We're back. Okay. We're back. Right. Okay. Now we're really back. Okay. So yeah, short story. Atmospheric temperature is linearly proportional to CO2 concentration. And the nice thing that lets us do is we can actually quantify how much CO2 we have left to emit in order to reach certain targets. So for example, we've cumulatively emitted about 2,500 gigatons of CO2. And if our goal is to remain within the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement, we have about 5 years left at our current rate of emissions, which is about 40 gigatons per year. And you can also play games going out further. So for example, 1.7 degrees C target would be about 14 years ahead, and we reach 2 degrees C warming in about 26 years. So we can also use those numbers to project, how long we have if we were to actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or if we were to just do, reduce our global emissions. And so, here's a couple possible projections about when we might hit those targets, depending on, how quickly we can actually reduce our own emissions from going into the atmosphere in the first place. So the problem is that a lot of these ambitions are overly ambitious. There's no way we're going to reduce our CO2 emissions this quickly. And so the carbon removal market actually has to grow quickly to keep up. So here's a couple projections, assuming, say, something like 6% annual growth, about how the gross negative emissions have to grow. So right now we're down at that orange dashed line at the bottom, and it's projecting like not much will happen for at least for the next 5 years, but then things have to start escalating quickly. And you can see by the time we get out past 2050, and especially out towards 2100, we have to remove a lot of CO2 every single year in order to keep up with emissions. So how much CO2 removal is actually required? The plot on the left shows the global carbon budget as a function of time. So you can see fossil fuels and industry have essentially monotonically increased their net emissions. Land use change has remained relatively constant over time. Land, atmosphere, and the oceans represent sinks. And so the ocean and land each take up about 25% of the CO2. The atmosphere takes about 50%. And so we project, based on these CO2 fluxes, that by 2050, our negative emissions, as far as like what we do in the ocean, will have to be about order 10 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is about the same size as the ocean cumulatively takes up now. And then by 2100, we're expecting that to nearly double. So we're talking about removing 20 gigatons per year through the ocean. That's just an immense quantity. But we know the ocean has to play a major role in carbon removal. Again, like I said, even as our emissions have continually increased over time, the ocean consistently takes up about a quarter of them. It is by far the largest carbon reservoir versus vegetation and soils in the atmosphere. Currently holds about 38,000 petagrams of net carbon, not CO2, just carbon. And the beauty of, or the beauty and the excitement about marine CDR is that it has the potential to scale. And it's one of the few types of interventions that can actually scale that far. There's a couple of reasons for this, a lot related to chemistry, some related to cost, but here's sort of a survey about different things you could possibly do. So for example, you have ocean alkalinity enhancement, essentially increasing the ocean's buffer capacity to store CO2. There's some exotic ideas like artificial upwelling and downwelling. Some other biological interventions that you may have heard of, such as microalgae cultivation or iron fertilization to grow phytoplankton, macroalgae cultivation like growing kelp and then sinking it. There's electrochemical solutions that people have proposed, and there's also ecosystem restoration. So sort of the reason why we're really excited, or at least markets are starting to get excited about ocean CDR, is that it can be cheap, and again, it can scale very far. So I'll call your attention to the stuff inside the red rectangle. So if we look at alkalinity enhancement in particular, if you look at the top, we see that it has the potential to be a very long duration form of sequestration, which is not true of some of these other possible interventions, such as reforestation, right? It's effective in the sense that it can remove potentially a lot of CO2 per year. It's low cost. The problem is that it's not technologically ready. And the reason it's not technologically ready is because actually measuring it is hard, which is where we come in. But if we stare at the rest of these possibilities, you can see that each one has some critical weaknesses, either in duration. Cost is a big one. So for example, direct air capture, which gets all the press, like literally building fans to suck in CO2, it's insanely expensive, and therefore there's no way it can scale, even though the technology is fairly ready and fairly easy. So you can see that the interest in these types of solutions is growing and growing quickly. So we're projecting it could be anywhere from tens of billions to even hundreds of billions of dollars worth of value by 2040. And I can tell you, even from working on this for just 1 year, the number of companies working in this space has probably doubled or tripled. So each of these companies is interested in doing one or more of the types of interventions that you saw a couple slides ago. Some have already gone out of business. We are not on here, again, because we are not a CO2 removal company. We're just establishing the science behind it. And so, yeah, that's the broken link of this chain. We can do CDR deployment. We can certify it. The problem is quantifying it is really hard, and I'll get into reasons why that is. Well, partly because it requires ocean modeling, which is why I'm here, and also ocean observations, which perhaps some of you have been involved in. So here we are. We are seaworthy. The mission is to build scientifically supported software to quantify ocean CDR and quantify its efficacy so that carbon markets can actually grow with a scientific backing. We're funded partly philanthropically, partly by US government funding, and also by private industry. We have a small but very potent team of people who you may have run across in your travels. We're collecting folks from academia, from research labs. A lot of us still work in academia and research labs while we're doing this. So, in a lot of ways, we operate like a very large, science group or study group, but with a focus on CDR in particular. So the vision is an ocean-based CO2 removal industry that contributes effectively and honestly to climate change mitigation and operates in a responsible manner. The mission is to build software to do this, and this calls again on our expertise as ocean modelers, fluid dynamicists, chemists, and just general functional scientists. So again, this is not a plug for our company. I don't like even the word company to describe what we're doing. We're just a big science group. We're not for profit. We're trying to be good scientists, basically acting as an arbiter of scientific credibility so that the carbon markets can spin up, again, with good scientific backing. We publish, we're still scientists, we're still proper academics, so we believe in transparency, peer review, you'll see our papers in all the major journals. Reproducibility, open source software, so we are building modeling systems. You can just go on GitHub and download them for free. There's no catches, none of that. A lot of the software we use, like ROMs and Marble and Beck, are probably things you may have used in the past or are familiar with at least. We are scientifically driven, meaning that our best practices evolve with our understanding of the science and of how to do these things. So, it's not like we claim to know all the answers now. We are growing as our scientific knowledge grows. And we are community oriented, which means that, we are building all of these things for the community, meaning you all and industry, so that, you can use our modeling tools freely to do your own work. And, we're happy to share that. And lastly, we want to be commercially relevant, meaning that we're seeking good, actionable frameworks to do monitoring, reporting, verification now, and also to improve into the future. The thing that makes us possible is kind of interesting, and I'm actually curious whether this concept exists in Europe or Asia. So we are operating as what we call a focused research organization, or a FRO. And if you look at this Venn diagram, you see that the FRO sort of sits at the intersection of these three major types, you could say. So, we want to be a large-scale effort, meaning that, we're informing sort of the global carbon removal market. But at the same time, we're producing public goods. We're not seeking profit. We're not doing this for private returns. And again, we operate as a small but potent team. We're not gigantic and bogged down by bureaucracy like a big research laboratory, but we're also bigger than an individual research group. So the idea is to kind of sit here in the middle so that we get the best of all these worlds. And so you can kind of imagine that, because of our situation kind of at the intersection of academia, industry, and government funding, we can sort of draw in resources from a lot of different groups and a lot of different interested parties. Yeah, and so again, we're scientists. We're all scientists right now. We don't really have any engineers or entrepreneurs in particular at the moment, but we seek to be a team of somewhere between probably 20 and 30 when this is all said and done. Again, the goal is to build high-impact public goods, such as data sets, models, and things that you all can use if you want. And we are sort of designed to go extinct after about 5 or 7 years. And so that's one thing that makes us very unique, is that, we are kind of by nature going to cease operating once we solve this problem, just like a typical science team would. And again, the goal is to actively translate technology into something that will live on, whether our modeling system lives at Woods Hole or somewhere else that the academic community and industry can make use of it. Okay, so we're starting to get into the science side of this talk. And so let me start talking about a little bit what we're trying to do from the scientific perspective. So the goal is to track carbon dioxide removal signals within the ocean and provide quantitative assessments of the effects of CDR and its baselines. Give people estimates about how much CO2 is removed, do validation, provide it in a cost-effective, easy-to-deploy way. The problem is that it's a really hard problem for a couple reasons. So one, it is a multi-scale problem, meaning that you do stuff at small scale, CO2 removal takes a long time, and by the time that happens, the ocean has moved it all over the world. And so modeling this is very challenging. Observing it is even harder. One reason for that is that the ocean is highly variable, as we all know. It's very turbulent. The background fields of, say, alkalinity have far larger amplitude than the types of interventions or perturbations we can do to it, which means that we're trying to measure something very small in a field of something very large. Again, observing anything in the ocean is challenging and expensive. And so, that's why ocean models are needed. We also need counterfactuals, meaning that we need to simulate what would have happened if we had not actually done the intervention in the first place. And so it almost requires like 2 experiments in one. And then, of course, we're scientists, and good scientists openly acknowledge that we don't know everything. Arguably, we don't know anything. So, we have incomplete knowledge about the processes, whether physical or chemical, about what's going to happen. I mean, we do know a lot, but we're always learning something new. So to give you an example of how complex the world's CO2 flux is, here's a nice movie of the CSM. Well, it's a CSM movie of the global CO2 flux coming out of the ocean. So red means that's outgassing, green means that it's ingassing. You can see that turbulence and all the other physical processes that we love to study make this really complicated and very spatially variable. So things that you may do over here in North America could be very different than doing things over here in Asia. And so, this isn't something where we can just assume a one-size-fits-all solution can work. And trying to switch slides again. Okay, all right. Here's a movie that I made last year, and it's going really slow. But so here's just a simulation of what a CO2 removal intervention might look like if you're looking down at the surface. So this is just a dye patch that I released somewhere in the ocean. And not surprisingly, the ocean eddy field is making that dye patch look very interesting in very short time. And so you could imagine that if you're trying to set out an array of observations to measure this, follow it, track it, or even an ocean model to try to figure out what's going on, it's not easy. So one other thing that makes this difficult, as I said before, is the fact that the background field actually would look more like this, meaning that in reality, if this was, for example, an alkalinity intervention, we'd be talking about massive concentrations in the background and then a tiny addition that you put on top of it. And so, again, measuring those tiny perturbations is actually really difficult just because there's so much background noise. So sort of to put numbers to that, the ocean has been taking up about 10 gigatons of CO2 annually over the last decade, which means that it's got about 100 gigatons additional to what it would have been naturally, and yet we still don't have very good confidence in the decadal change in deep water inventory of DIC. And just to put sort of a concrete example in front of you, so this is a direct air capture plant. Again, these are the little fans that are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. 10 gigatons per year is about 25 million of these things. And so it gives you an example of like why this solution cannot scale, but also the problem that we're facing as chemists and physicists trying to understand how to do this type of measurement. So what does MCDR actually look like? So there's sort of two phases to this. So no matter what type of intervention you do, whether it's microalgae cultivation or alkalinity enhancement, the goal is to decrease the partial pressure of CO2 in the surface ocean. And so here's sort of a schematic of how that would work, where this is the PCO2 in microatmospheres. Over a very short time, the goal is to draw down the partial pressure of CO2 to some perturbed level. And then after that is where either the success or failure happens. So, that change in the ocean PCO2 allows atmospheric drawdown of CO2 to happen via gas exchange. So the ocean starts pulling in CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's where the GFD comes in, and that's where it gets really interesting, perhaps for you all, because there's sort of two scenarios or two extreme scenarios that you can imagine. One is that if that water actually goes away from the surface and the atmosphere never sees that change in PCO2, then you get nothing. There is no CO2 drawdown and the efficiency is zero. Or the other extreme is that that water that you perturbed actually stays at the surface or at least in the mixed layer the entire time. So it completes the CO2 removal, and then you get an efficiency of 100%. The reality is somewhere in the middle. Best case thermodynamically is that we get about 85% CO2 removal for a given quantity of perturbation. But that, again, that's quite variable, and I will get into why very shortly. All right, so chemically and physically, there's a lot of challenges here. So for example, it depends on mixed layer depth, again, keeping that water near the surface, the gas transfer velocity, which is a function of wind speed, the Removel factor, which is the change in DIC for a given change in the PCO2. Again, spatial variability, gas transfer velocity may be different near the coast, right, versus out in the open ocean. CDR obviously is going to happen where it's very accessible and very cheap, which means that it's a little more likely to be near coastlines. I've discussed already that it's difficult to track water for the full amount of time that it'll take to do the equilibration. So just to put numbers to it, it will take 10 plus years for a given, say, alkalinity perturbation to fully equilibrate. And again, by that time, the ocean circulation takes it all over the place. And also, actually observing that is pretty much impossible even after a couple days. All right, and so that brings us here and now. So we're here at a meeting talking about this. I want to talk about this, and so this talk is going to sit right here. And I hope you all find this next part very thought-provoking. Okay, here's a list of challenges. And so this sort of sets the stage for what we're trying to do at Seaworthy and what you all might do if you're interested in these types of problems. So challenge 1 is understanding and representing processes that mediate exchange of materials across the base of the mixed layer. So again, this comes back to the schematic here. Does the water that you perturb stay in the mixed layer, which means you get a lot of efficiency of CO2 removal, or does it leave, meaning you get very little efficiency? There's a lot of things, both physically and chemically, that can mediate this. So for example, you may recall or may have learned at some point about the biological pump or the solubility pump. There's also just straight physical subduction and abduction. There is sedimentation, again, because we're actually dropping stuff in the water. And that stuff could be minerals or other types of chemicals. Maybe what we're more familiar with here is the actual physical processes governing entrainment, detrainment, advection, diffusion, both in the horizontal and vertical directions, eddies. And we're just trying to understand like what keeps things in the mixed layer where we can get high efficiency. The interplay with biology makes things especially interesting. So here's a couple pictures of kelp that have died, dissolved, and sunk. So this can actually be a really rapid way of removing a lot of carbon from the surface, which is one reason why some companies are considering doing this commercially. So that's a whole different modeling problem, right? Because these aren't just passive particles. These actually have weight. They have negative buoyancy, different buoyancy from each other, for example. And so the GFD problem is to do all these simulations of ocean mixing with particles that actually sink or settle. All right, challenge number 2, I will call the timescale challenge. So again, this is just kind of keeping the schematic up here so y'all can remember what we're trying to do. So what timescales are present that govern either things remaining in the mixed layer or removal from the mixed layer? And so there have been a lot of papers over the years that have talked about things like residence time, age, which is one thing we're very interested in climate modeling, transit time, exposure time, and here's just a simple schematic of an estuary showing the difference between these things. One reason we might want to be interested in this, again, is that if you do a CDR intervention somewhere near the coast, but that signal travels across the entire ocean, then you might want to be interested in like, okay, where did we do that such that it was most efficient, so that the next company that comes along to do the intervention can also follow those steps, and it just sort of creates a good set of practices about where, when, and why to do these types of things. All right, challenge number 3 is one that's very close to my heart. It's more efficient modeling of what we call additionality, right? So this gets back to the idea that additionality is the thing that you did that's additional to what would have happened anyways. So when you do an alkalinity perturbation, for example, how much additional CO2 did it remove versus what would have happened naturally? So again, going back to this sort of challenge where, yeah, we can do something locally, for example, here off the coast of Africa, within 1 year, it's probably quadrupled in size, and within sort of the 15 years it takes to equilibrate, it's over half of the world ocean. It would be kind of wasteful if we did this type of large-scale modeling for the entire 15 years, right? Because like right near the beginning, we really care just about this small area. And so, you might consider, say, a multi-stage modeling process where you start just with a really small-scale model, and then as the signal grows, you grow too, or at least your domain grows. So it's sort of a strategic way of saving costs, saving time, and hopefully getting better representation at each stage of that. So challenge number 4 is about physics. And so how do different physical scales affect uptake efficiency? So I assume a lot of people here are familiar with turbulence and all of the interesting things that happen with turbulence, such as filamentation, subduction, things like that. And so, this is also a function of time. So for example, this is off the coast of Louisiana in the United States, so in the Gulf of Mexico, just a view of the surface divergence in wintertime versus in summertime. Very different scales. And also the vorticity field in wintertime versus summertime, again, also very different scales. The turbulence introduces uncertainty, meaning that the answer you may get from doing one experiment may be very different than what you get from another experiment, even if it's taken at the same time. And that variability and uncertainty can be of a seasonal nature or an interannual nature, or again, as a function of space. And this sort of speaks to this big challenge that I've discussed, which is the fact that this is all inherently very multi-scale. Things are important at every single scale, from the microscale, which is like what's happening inside the tank of sodium hydroxide that you're carrying around in your boat, to the near field, which is what happens after you release it from the boat, and as it grows from local scale to regional scale to global scale. Anyone here who has done modeling understands that there are very different things at play at each scale, but in this problem, all of them are important. And so here's another potential modeling challenge that I'm actually working on right now. It's this notion of upscaling. So oftentimes when we run regional ocean models, we're interested in sort of the reverse, which is downscaling, where you go from a big domain with a big solution down to smaller and smaller domains. This is kind of the reverse of that. And so these images these schematics are actually inspired by something we're doing in San Francisco Bay Area, where we're going to be working on a alkalinity enhancement experiment. And so that signal is going to start somewhere really small inside the bay here. But as I said, over the ensuing weeks, months, years, it's going to grow into the California current system and then eventually spread all across the Pacific. So how do you represent something that started so small and so concentrated into a modeling field or a domain that is this big? So we've talked about, or at least we've thought about, things like parametrizations. I'll call it reverse nested models, meaning that rather than downscaling these regional simulations, you actually upscale them going the other way, or even adding sort of a forcing term in your alkalinity budget or your biogeochemical model to represent the changes as you go upscale. So it's kind of an interesting modeling problem that we don't really have a good answer for right now. This is also related to computational cost. And so here's actual diagram from a proposal we submitted about this actual experiment in San Francisco Bay. We wanted to do some modeling of it. And so we thought about what it would take to do those modeling experiments correctly, meaning quantify uncertainty and everything like that. So of course, it's going to start with an ocean model with a biogeochemical model attached to it. We're doing the baseline counterfactual, as I discussed. It has multiple domains and resolutions for multiple years. Again, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty because of the turbulence, and so we want a full ensemble of experiments. And that all worked out to over 16 million hours of CPU time, which is in monetary terms about 500,000 US dollars, and that's to do one experiment. So this is really expensive, even to do on a computer. And so one thing that we're considering is, and I invite suggestions, is what are better ways to do this kind of modeling? So, do you deploy your code on GPUs with oceananigans? If any of you have heard of that, that's one very new way of approaching ocean modeling. We're also considering machine learning techniques or surrogate models such as impulse response functions, which may allow us to do this far more cheaply because we just can't live with that number. All right, challenge number 9 is what happens in the real world. So for example, if you have a tank of sodium hydroxide sitting on the back of a ship, how do you deploy it without violating local environmental standards? So here's a scenario. For example, you want to dump your sodium hydroxide into the wake of this ship, and there's a lot of literature talking about what this wake would look like. So questions, how far or fast does a solution diffuse in a given time? what's the maximum flow rate you can actually dump this stuff into the water without spiking the pH so much that it kills everything in its path. What path does the ship need to travel so that you don't dump too much in any given spot and actually allow it to diffuse? And then lastly, when do you do it? So depending on where you are, the tides may matter, the weather might matter. You know, you need to be very careful. And again, this is all informed by stuff that we're actually doing now. Here's a really interesting one that we haven't thought about, but perhaps some of you may have worked on something similar. So, you know, we're in the ocean, of course. We have lots of different physics, Langmuir circulations, waves, bubbles, all that stuff, right? But you're dumping stuff in the water. So, you know, you might think that it just sort of settles down with what we call Stokes settling, where it just all kind of drops uniformly. But as we know, the ocean is a very violent, turbulent mixture. It is sheared in the vertical, and so you get lots of different types of turbulence or instabilities. So for example, Rayleigh-Taylor, Kelvin-Helmholtz, or some combination of the two that can actually accelerate or decelerate the settling, which of course affects the alkalinity or the CO2 uptake. And you know, there's so many different ways to change this problem depending on what you're putting in, its buoyant properties. I think that's very, very interesting. So sort of related to that is this notion of buoyant plumes. So for example, not every alkalinity or intervention or CDR intervention has to be dumped at the surface. So one example would be to do it via what we call an outfall pipe, where you have a outflow of something sitting underneath the surface. And the question is, how buoyant is that stuff that you're putting in down here versus the density of seawater? So for example, you could have a density current where it all just falls down the slope. It could be neutrally buoyant, where it just kind of sits there in the middle of the water column, or it could be positively buoyant, where it actually comes up to the surface. Here's a couple experiments run by Mina Ho at UCLA, where she simulates different, we'll call it buoyant plumes, from a source here. You know, some of them sit near the bottom, some of them actually just rise up and get neutrally buoyant somewhere in the middle of the column. And so again, this is very relevant to the problem of measuring this stuff, because if it never reaches the surface, it's much harder to measure and it's impossible to see. All right, here's a kind of a fun one, macroalgae. So growing kelp or growing other marine plants. So you can get really, really fine scale with this. So this set of researchers actually took real plants and not only did lab experiments measuring their turbulent wakes, but also did numerical experiments doing the same. And so here's just a little here's just a couple plots of the simulated vorticity field as the water flows through kelp, which is kind of cool. And I think this is the last one. So I talked about gas exchange velocity. So essentially what controls the amount of gas entering the ocean from the atmosphere. There are pretty robust scaling laws for this. So it's sort of known that the transfer velocity goes about as the wind speed squared, but there's a lot of ways you can mess with that problem. So for example, when the wind gets really strong, you get a lot of spray, to the point where if you're in a hurricane, it becomes, you know, the atmospheric boundary layer becomes so wet and so moist that it's actually kind of hard to discern what is the ocean and what is the atmosphere. And so you can imagine lots of problems talking about breaking surface waves, injection of bubbles. You know, the physics start to change a lot, and this part of the observational, this part of the observations up here, very high wind speeds, is not very well observed, and so there's a lot of work to be done there. So all in all, I hope that you know, this has been kind of interesting, or at least thought-provoking. Like, these are very important problems that we're trying to address. Now, we're not able to address nearly all of them, or even many of them at Seaworthy, but you know, the academic community has a lot of potential to grab onto these things. You know, there's so much crossover with geophysical fluid dynamics that, you know, it's really interesting for me as a physicist and as an ocean modeler, but hopefully, you know, some of you can maybe find your way into this field. So again, this is all about, you know, mitigating climate change. You know, the ocean has a ton of ability to take up CO2, and this is really about, informing the future carbon market, because it's going to come whether we do this or not. And so establishing good MRV standards is super important to us. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting research questions, and so I encourage you to take a look. So thank you all very much, and yeah, happy to take questions.
All right, we've got really as much time for. Sorry, we've got some time for questions. Can people hear me? I can't imagine anyone has any thoughts about this presentation. So, but we'll take a few questions anyway. Let's try any students who have a thought first. All right. Some non-students.
Okay, some non-students. You didn't mention ocean acidification, right? I mean, if the idea is to put more CO2 in, well, then it changes the pH and the corals and all that. So that's one question. And then Pascal had a question about, well,
okay, thanks, David. Yeah, I was wondering what the relative CO2 intake at little hotspots globally distributed is relative to what gets taken up and ends up in the meridional overturning circulation, which will come up much later.
Yeah. We've only been able to model this at very coarse scale. So we actually have what we call an MRV map that we've put online. I don't have the link right now, but I'm happy to send it to you. We've done a set of models at about 1 degree resolution, and generally we see that the best efficiency happens when you do the perturbation at low latitudes, just because it tends to stay near the surface longer. There's not so many hot spots, but there are definitely cold spots where you definitely don't want to do it, and that would be in subduction regions. So not that anyone would ever go to the Labrador Sea to do this kind of stuff, but don't do it there, because the signal just leaves the surface immediately, and you can see on the map, it's just, nothing good happens. Yeah. So there's the coral question. What was the question?
the whole point is to put the CO2 into the ocean, right? And so it becomes carbonic acid and it changes the pH. And so the corals, I guess there's less bicarbonate or something, less carbonate, I guess. And so it's harder to make the shells and so forth. And sorry, my chemistry is a bit rusty, but something like that happens and there's coral bleaching and so forth.
Yeah, so the perturbations that were proposed, that are being proposed, usually like alkalinity enhancement, for example, it's drawing in CO2, but the ocean carbon cycle converts that to carbonate and then bicarbonate, which is taken up by corals with no change in the pH, right? So it's actually beneficial for them.
Okay, I thought it was the opposite. I thought that
no, because what you're drawing in, the CO2 gets converted to something else that.
No, I understand
isn't
that,
acidifying, yeah.
Thank you. So I was just wondering, like, in terms of the anthropogenic warming of the oceans, the rising stratification is also one of the major challenges. So have you any thought about it, like when we have the stratification, so how you can put the maximum amount of CO2 into the ocean, because it won't allow the mixing?
Yeah, I don't think well, are you asking about like what kinds of like fluid dynamics the stratification would?
Yeah, with the rising temperature of the oceans.
Yeah, I know there have been some studies about how changing like ocean stratification with climate change would affect things. The problem is that we haven't been able to project very far in the future. So I was actually on a proposal to do this a couple years ago. And a lot of the things that mediate, especially the upper ocean stratification, like submesoscale eddies, are at such small scale that you can't really get a good global view of it happening. So you kind of have to pretend like you know what's going to happen there. I've done some experiments personally where I have looked at changes to, say, the upper ocean turbulence, say 50 years in the future, and it's usually not enough to matter that much, at least in the sense of like changing the overall answer. So yeah, it's a curious question, but from what I've seen, I don't think it would change our strategy.
Yeah, and one last question from my side, like when we talk about the climate variability, so as far as we know that the ENSOs are getting more intense and frequent. So whatever the things that you're gonna put in, so what are the likelihood that the things going to be outgassed from the ocean because of these variabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. It very much depends on what it is that you're doing. So for example, the storage timescale for sinking kelp could be very different than for doing alkalinity enhancement. Depends on where it is, right? Like there are spots where you could just do something and then it comes right back out. So I don't have an answer for that, but it is stuff that we have to think about. It's like, where do you do it and when do you do it and how, such that you get long sequestration and that long lifespan is really something we need to worry about. And this is also something that the carbon markets are worried about, because it's like, as an example, like right now with reforestation or afforestation, it's like, yeah, you grow a tree and then it burns down 5 years from now in a fire. Like, how much carbon did you actually sequester? Like 0, right? So, that also has to go into the actual like monetary accounting too. So yeah, it's a big question that we're sort of working on. That's all I can say. Yeah.
On the warming, on the surface warming and increased stratification, I know there was some discussion maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago that might be an important part of the kind of impact of the surface atmospheric warming, and it would decrease the ability of the ocean to sequester carbon. But from the carbon dioxide removal side, it's the opposite. It actually makes it easier to take the CO2 out of the surface, but then have the low P CO2 water stay at the surface.
Good.
That's interesting, because I had never thought about it that way before. So it's kind of a bit of a reversal.
Yeah, that mixed layer residence time is so important.
Manita.
Yeah, you mentioned transit times and ages, so maybe you're familiar with the transit time distribution theory, where you can also estimate transit times and mean ages.
Sorry, I couldn't understand that.
Okay, better now?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned transit times and ages, so maybe you're familiar with the transit time distribution theory, where you also get a PDF of transit times and mean ages, but you also mentioned residence time.
Yeah.
So could you tell me what is the difference between transit time and residence time?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's on that slide.
Okay.
Yeah, they're very similar. I know that. The exact definition I cannot recall, but yeah, they're similar. I'll direct you to that paper if you want to look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think residence time is what's really, the surface residence time is what you're talking about here. I mean, transit time is usually like how long was it for water to get to the surface to some other place.
Transit, and then there's residence time, and then like residence time is the amount of time in a single event that it stays where you want it. And then there's another one called exposure time, which is like it could go down and then come back up, and then that's that second period is also added on top of it. So that's another big question, is like what happens when the thing sinks and then comes back? Like, how does that account for stuff?
For transit time, it seems like you need a start and an end place. Like you need to know where.
Right. So you have a water mass somewhere in the interior, and the transit time is the time it takes to travel from the surface or mixed layer to this water mass.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting talk. I'm actually, how do you splitting the carbon? You have like inorganic and organic carbon, and both of them, it's just like kind of joke, but removing carbon from the ocean, from the sediments, you're making bad job for future scientists who study mass extinctions. because Dan Rothman from MIT, actually, he associating mass extinction with carbon deposit, burial carbon in the ocean. So, I mean, removing it, you cannot build a quite good model to learn what's happened in the past. Just a comment.
Okay. Cool. Anybody else? Okay.
I have one more question. Sure. I'll just talk loud. Where's all the money going to come for this carbon market?
Well, either compulsory carbon markets, right? Like governments basically putting effectively a tax on it, or there's voluntary carbon markets like what you see in, well, the US has a voluntary one now. I think Europe has a compulsory one or is starting to, I think, right?
Without that, there's no way it can really happen. I mean, not for real.
Yeah, this is a big discussion, right? Like there's a sort of a carrot and a stick, and sometimes both really help. But yeah, there's sort of like social capital associated with it too, where like companies don't want to be like, you know, the one that's doing a lot of damage. So there's kind of both sides, like private investment and also government mandated.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice talk. I have more like, because you said you are in between, you're like a non-profit organization. What I was wondering, I understand the question that it's quite hard to measure if CO2 uptake works or not. And but I was wondering, shouldn't be also the risk assessment be a big part of it? I was missing that.
Yeah, I probably should have put that on there. Yes, the risk assessment is a big part of it, especially as it pertains to ecosystems, right? Because you're doing stuff that is changing the chemical properties of the water, and you know, there's a lot of crossover into like, is this safe? So yeah, it is something that we haven't done any projects on that specifically right now, but for example, we are doing one experiment in Iceland right now in association with some other companies, and you know, one of the big requirements that they've put on us in order to do this field experiment is like, you cannot, you know, exceed a certain pH threshold or do any obvious damage to the environment. And so, you know, things like designing our, you know, release strategy of these chemicals all sort of governs around like, you know, are you going to stay within those safety thresholds? So that's all part of the risk assessment. And so, yeah, it's absolutely important here.
Okay, and then another question related to that would be, does the ocean really allow us to take more CO2? Because as far as I understood, it's like now the ocean is taking much more CO2 than ever before in our presence on Earth. But how do we know that the ocean really is supposed to, or can take more CO2 without reaching some limits?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why we're doing you know, essentially artificial interventions, right? The ocean's going to essentially take up 25% no matter how much we throw in the atmosphere. And, you know, as it does so, it gets more acidic. But, you know, we're essentially enhancing its buffer capacity to draw in CO2 by, you know, moving some of that CO2 to other stuff like carbonate, bicarbonate. And so, you know, by doing these chemical interventions, essentially we're purposely changing the chemistry so it can pull more in. And you know, that can actually be quite beneficial if done safely.